As we start week 6, we're going to be getting into some of the basic issues that affect sport and in how they affect our society, and these are going to be some of the areas where you will be writing your major paper that will be due at the end of the class. This week we're going to talk about race and women in sport, a little bit about ethnicity. We have 2 other videos that I want you to watch and a few slides. I'm going to try to just hit the highlights for you about these issues so that we can kind of get an overview. You have to fill in the blanks, as we've always said, with your readings, because there's no way we can do this on all of these presentations. But race has probably been the one that comes to mind in most people's mind when we talk about societal issues and their issues with sport. There's a lot of them. Women in sport have been certainly a part of my life since I began my career, one I am very familiar with, and the ethnicity of different groups that we don't always talk about also are listed in your book. Before we get into the substance, though, let's talk a little bit about the next section of Freedom's Christian Heritage. As we move into week 6 and talking about the Christian heritage of our country, remember we've talked about universities and people and documents, our leaders. We're going to be talking about our buildings. But one of the things that probably has had the most controversy from people who would like to get God out of all of this is our Pledge of Allegiance. One nation under God. Over the past recent years, there has been a trend or a push to remove under God from our Pledge of Allegiance. And, of course, those of us who are believers would certainly be against that. You can be a believer, I guess, and still be for it if you think that there are more than one God, and our country was founded under more than one God, and our country was not founded under more than one God. It was founded under the God that we know, who is our Father, and Jesus Christ, as we can tell in the documents and in the people that formed our country. But I think it's really important, and you need to look farther ahead in the course onto week 8, where you're going to be asked to write a paper, a reaction paper, to the times when we have discussed the heritage of our country founded under Christian principles, under the verse Psalm 33:12, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord." And that verse is pretty profound, because it's saying God will bless our nation as long as we keep God at the top of our nation. And it was founded on these purposes, and as sport business managers and sport people, we come into this all the time with the Pledge of the Flag or the National Anthem, which is certainly not a religious song, but we need to know where we stand individually, and you as young people need to know where you stand when you come up against people who would want to take God out of our buildings, out of our documents, and most specifically out of our pledge, and how you feel about that. And you need to know how you feel and be okay about that. So this is the biggest thing, I think one of the biggest things that talks about our nation being founded, one nation under God, with liberty and justice for all. Sometimes we don't think it has justice for all, and sometimes it doesn't show that it does. But I think God would intend it for it to be that way according to His Word. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. We begin our subject and our issue of race and ethnicity in sport. I think it's important to just review briefly some definitions. Race, of course, is a category that's discusses people with genetic similarities, and whereas ethnicity is a cultural heritage of a group. And of course, racism is the erroneous belief in the superiority of one race over another, which is the basic problem in sport and race right now. And then a minority group is any group in the United States other than whites. So as you think of these four terms, you need to be very careful that you know the difference. In racism, we have unusual distributions of whites and blacks in certain sport positions that cannot be explained by simply random distribution. For example, all quarterbacks are white, running backs are black. What we look at as stacking is something that we want to get away from. We have mostly white coaches, and in racism, it is where whites are in the thinking positions and in the outcome control positions, where the blacks are in speed positions. This is something that is a phenomenon in sport, and something that I think society needs to be extremely careful about using these stereotypes to determine who's good at what. It should not have anything to do with that, and yet as you look throughout sport and professional sport, and even in high school and college sports, you tend to see this stacking taking place. Let's explore a little bit some of the obvious things that are happening with minority athletes, how they are exploited. First of all, if they have educational shortcomings, they're ignored. Kids are allowed into college based on their athletic ability rather than on their educational ability. They also do not get the opportunities a lot of times to bring those educational shortcomings up to standard. Then once they're in college or in school, they're promoted with regardless of their academic performance. And it's exploitation of these young people. That means we don't pay any attention to anything other than their athletic ability, and we push them through school when they're not meeting the standards. And then in college, they're pressured into easy majors. I was very much aware of this in my intercollegiate coaching experience. Not that we did that in our program, but we saw it happen in many programs, especially on the male side, where these athletes were not college prepped yet. They weren't prepared to go to college, so they would get them in based on their athletic ability, and then they'd put them into a major they thought was easy for them. This is not a right way to treat anyone. We need to make sure that we are treating people equally and that it's not about their race that makes these kinds of things happen. Continuing our discussion briefly and summarizing some of the other things that are happening in our society in terms of exploitation of these minority athletes. Because of it, our graduation rates are very low. Going back to the slide before, where you're talking about allowing students to come into college when they're underprepared, and then pushing them through easy majors, and then a lot of them, when their eligibility is over, they drop out. Pro teams and colleges, they want athletes in school for reasons that are unrelated to athletes' best interests. They want them for their physical abilities, and they don't pay attention to developing them as in the whole person. And then African American women are exploited due to both race and gender. They have a double problem. In the next chapter, and this week, and you'll be watching a video on the gender situation. We have a few slides on that. When you're talking about a minority female, their exploitation is even doubled. Because of the exploitation and all of the things that we have just briefly talked about and the things that you will read about, sport then becomes a negative force in equality. We think of sport as being so positive, but these are the things that give evidence to the fact that sport is a negative force in equality. It doesn't help; it hurts it. To make young people think that they can get into the pros, it's an unrealistic goal. Adults will tell young people this. College graduation rate for black males is about 50%. For black females, it's 60%. And I like this one is an amazing statistic that black families are 8 times more likely than whites to pressure their children into sport, because that's what we see. We see the black pro athlete male and female, and athletes are thinking if their kids can be good in sport, they will have an equal chance. And because of the exploitation and what we're doing, then sport becomes a negative force in reaching this equality goal. Then just real briefly talking about a few other ethnic groups, we tend to talk about blacks and whites and their relationship, but in the Latino Hispanic athletes, they're recognized for certain sports, for baseball and for soccer. If you look down through the pros and see in each one of these sports how many Latinos and Hispanic athletes are playing these sports. In the Asian culture, the sport is not used for means to economic, social, or educational goals. Asians think differently generally about sport. They don't see it as a means to get to an economic or social educational level. The Native Americans, the Native American Sports Council is part of the Olympic movement, and the North American Indigenous Games is a big event. So each one of these ethnic groups, please read more about it so that you can understand, if you choose to do your paper in one of these subjects, that you will understand a little bit about the differences, some of the stereotypes, and because of this, we have a negative influence of sport sometimes. Now, these are not such negative issues. It's just what is the sports that these athletes particularly play, or what the Asian culture may think of sport, but they are just a reference to the other ethnic groups in our society. Just as we talked about sport as a negative force in equality, obviously we think a lot about the positive forces that sport has in equality. One being that it is linked to self-confidence. A role model can be a positive role model. And if we've all played sports, and we know that the self-confidence that you get from playing a sport without regard to race or ethnicity or gender, the sport itself is linked to that, and that is a positive force in bringing us all to being treated and thought of as equals. Also, it offers a way out of poverty for some, blacks, whites, Hispanics, Asians, all groups. We tend to think that a lot of times it's mostly for the black athlete, but that's not true. It offers a way out of poverty for everyone, for every young person who looks at their sport as a means to an end, to get an education, to become a positive force in society. Sport offers that as a vehicle. And then a lot of times integration among races is easier in sport. I've always felt that you can say that you are in a college, for example, where there's a lot of diversity, or you're in a job where there's a lot of diversity, but you don't integrate until you really get to know someone. And when you do, all of a sudden, none of these other things like race or gender or any kind of ethnicity make any difference. And sport gives us an opportunity to integrate with everyone, and we end up being all one on teams and as we compete in sport. And this is a very positive force, one that I particularly like talking about more than the negative force. But we need to understand both of these in relationship to their influence on our society. Continuing on with a few other things that illustrate that sport is a positive force in equality, we have the fact that some school-based programs are free, and where some young people could not afford to go and be in those that are costly, there are some school-based programs are free. Unfortunately, more and more now they're not free, and that is not a good thing. But because of the way schools are supported, it's one of the things that they do to cut budgets. But as long as they are free, that is a positive force in bringing people to equality. This is a really good one, and I've experienced this so much in over 30 years of coaching and being involved in sport business, is that because of sport, you can travel. There's so many places that I have traveled, and I've seen young people who've never been able to almost get out of their cities, let alone out of their state, never been on airplanes, never been overseas, never been across the country, never seen anything else, but sport allows them to travel, and it raises their awareness of the world. And without that, you don't really get it. And sport gives young people that opportunity. And then the last one briefly, obviously, sport can encourage a healthy lifestyle. So I like talking about the positive things. I like trying to feel that we can integrate all of these positive ones and make them override the negative ones. But the negative ones that we've talked about are extremely important issues in our society, ones that I hope as we are in sport business, we can help make them better. While we're talking about race, we're all supposed to be looking at the gender issue in sport, and this all is based on Title IX, which is a federal law, and I want to just briefly talk to you about something that I think everyone who is involved in sport business should at least know what these three things are, so that when someone says Title IX to you, they know, first of all, it's a gender thing. It's about equal opportunity for women to be involved in sport as equality. We're trying to get that, and it's equal to the men. And there's a test that each university needs to go through and questions they need to ask in order to know whether they are in compliance with this federal law. The first question is this: are participant numbers proportionate to enrollment? What that basically means is whatever the proportion of men to women are in the general institution, general population, for example, if it's 60% women and 40% men in College A or University A, then the question is your athletic numbers need to be the same. This is one way to say we are in compliance with the federal law. Yes, we have 60% women athletes and 40% male athletes. That's one test. It's not the only test, but it is a test. And most programs in the beginning, when Title IX first happened, used this as a test. If there were 60% men in the general population, and then there were 60% men in the athletics, there were 40% women, or whatever the percentage was, the athletic participation needed to mirror. The problem, of course, was in football, because let's say that the proportion in the general population is 60% women and 40% men, because football has so many participants, it was really very difficult to mirror that proportionality. So what happened was a lot of men's sports like wrestling, gymnastics, they were dropped to lower the men's program numbers so that football could stay and the women's numbers would be in proportion to the general enrollment. That's one way. That's not the only way, and a lot of times people thought that was the only way. Number two was if you aren't going to use the first one, proportionality, are you going to use the second one, that the school can show a history of progress? In other words, you can look back through your history and say, we've added this women's sport, we've added this women's sport, we've added this women's sport, and we are making a progress in increasing the enrollment for women. In many cases, that was easier to do because the proportionality was so difficult to meet. And then the last one was, does the school accommodate their students' interests, what the students want? For example, if you didn't have a women's basketball team and the students at the school wanted a women's basketball team, knowing that basketball was such a popular sport, was the university accommodating women by providing that sport? The issue with this one is that usually the school could prove that they are accommodating the students in the school, when the interpretation of this was more, is it accommodating the students that want to go to that school? The women that would go to school A to have basketball, but they wouldn't go because they didn't have a basketball team. That's just an illustration. So I think the first two are better tests of whether or not women have equality in college education, college athletics. I could talk a long time about this, and I don't want to, because you have other things in your presentations that you need to listen to. But please read carefully in your textbook the material about Title IX. It's the basic gender issue. These are some basic social issues in women's sport and physical activity benefit. Increased self-esteem, decreased drug use, decreased chance of pregnancy, unwanted pregnancy. The graduation rate is increased, and sport was a helpful experience for 4 out of 5 women executives. These are the social issues that show that sport has a physical and a social benefit to women as they participate. Women generally feel better about themselves. They don't want to get pregnant. I've had many athletes down through the 30 years that I coached who are pregnant, more than I wish. But each one was handled a little differently. I think young people, young women who go into college who may not really want to go to college, their graduation is good because they want to stay eligible. And it's interesting that you talk to women who are executives high up in business companies. 4 out of 5 of them were involved in sport, are athletes, were athletes, and say that that was a helpful experience to them as they grew to that level of being an executive. Highlight some of the social issues that we face in women's sport. Certainly there's a gender conflict over orientation labels. A lot of people have believed in the past that if women are really interested in sport, that maybe they are a lesbian or maybe their sexual orientation isn't really clear, and that's a conflict. Early on in my coaching, we had women who would not go into athletics because of that. It's changing a lot now, but it is a conflict for some women. The athletic apparel has always been an issue. First it's all looks like the men. It doesn't fit us, or it's dowdy looking. And now what's happened is because the athletic apparel has really, really gotten better, they're making things to fit women. They're not just buying the same thing for women as they used to for men, but they're making it fit our bodies. And because women's bodies now are muscular and very well defined muscularly, women still have an objectification issue where they're thought of as sex symbols rather than as athletes. It's very sensitive to hear the media talk about what a woman looks like, about her hair, what she has on, where you don't hear that from men. And that's what we mean by this objectification of athletes, where you look at them for a different reason than what they're participating in. So these are some issues that are ongoing. They're ones that, as women more and more at a young age start to participate in sport, society is changing their view of that, and it's becoming a very positive thing for women. And that's why women are growing in their role in leadership, in politics, in religion, in sport, in every area of our society. Another thing about an issue in women, and this is the sexual orientation. For lesbian athletes, we have an acceptance that's grown in the past 20 years. Still, athletes and coaches are assumed to be lesbian face misunderstanding and discrimination. And along this line, I'd like to just mention that women in sport who have been labeled and discriminated against because of this, we tend to forget about the gay athlete on the men's side. There are so many more gay men in athletics professionally in college than we know about, because it is much more of a secret with them. And it doesn't need to be. It needs to be accepted that these athletes, gay and lesbian, need to be treated equally in our society as they face discrimination in their participation in sport. This is not about what someone feels, whether it's right or wrong, or you like it or you don't like it. This is about equality in sport. And these athletes, both men and women, need to be accepted and treated as equals and brought into the sporting community and looked at for their prowess, their participation, their excellence as athletes. And I think it's important that we understand that this is getting better, but it applies to both genders.